Hello, I'm Alexa. You're listening to Adapted by Design. And today I'm so excited because my friend PK is on the show, and we're going to be talking about design careers at startups. PK is the VP of design at a growing startup called Flex. But before that, he was at Fast, Turo, and Hopper, quite the startup portfolio. But PK, we met when you were first at Fast, which was a relatively small startup, right? And then Fast ended up getting acquired by Affirm, which is a much bigger company. And even though they brought on the whole design team, you decided to switch things up about 5 months later. Is that right?
That sounds about right. Yeah, they took actually about half the company. So it was a full company, but a lot of us moved over to Affirm.
Okay. So yeah, a good amount of the designers moved over. You ended up leaving 5 months later. So I guess I'd just love to start by hearing about that story. Why did you decide to move on to something else after Fast was acquired?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, startups and how long you stay at them is always an interesting question to me. I've had companies I've stayed at for years, 4 years, actually, and companies I've stayed at for 6 months. So Affirm kind of fits that second bucket. And I had a great time. Lots of good people. Lots of people I worked with at a previous company. But I've always been, if you look at my overall, track record, really interested in building new things. And while Affirm is doing a lot of really good stuff, they're a public company, and it's just a bit of a different environment. So I enjoyed it. I mean, I think I learned a lot about working at a public company, which I hadn't really done before. But I think I knew pretty early that I had to go back into startups and something earlier.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Like, what really drew you to Flex, and like what sort of what were your goals with that switch over, back over into more of that startup land?
Yeah, well, so it almost is worth prefacing the answer to why Flex with, why do I like startups and kind of how I landed on a few of them. If I had to sum that part up, it's like, I think I really enjoyed finding products with super simple premises that everyday people can understand. So my family's Greek. I'm a child of Greek immigrants. If I can go to my parents and say the elevator pitch for what I'm doing, they can understand it. I tend to enjoy those types of problems because everyone can understand that, even if that full reality is a little harder under the hood. And so, you mentioned a few of the companies I worked at. They all, at their core, all being more complicated than they were, had really simple premises. So, Opera was buying flights for cheap. We were actually using big data to do that, and it's a pretty complicated and hard problem to solve. But like for the overall consumer, it doesn't matter. You're just trying to find a cheap flight. I went to Turo, which is really renting someone else's car. Easy premise. And Fast was, and actually Affirm as well, is buying something online. We all do that these days. For the most part, I should say all maybe, but lots of people do that. And so, ultimately, to me, that was another just really simple premise. How can you make that thing that we do online pretty often easier? And so Flex kind of follows that trend for me. I really liked the problem they were solving. I could give that pitch, but the simple version of it is that you're paying rent. Excuse me. It's your number one discretionary expense. It's usually the highest one for most people. And ultimately, it's actually getting worse for a lot of folks in a lot of cities. And so Flex is about really trying to make that more flexible. Discretionary spend is something you can't avoid. How can you add more flexibility into that? Because typically you don't have control over it. It happens at the first of the month. Someone else sets the timing when you have to pay it. And it also doesn't really map with most people's biweekly paychecks. And so, you end up getting paid something for half the month, but you end up paying your full month at that moment. And that can really drain a bank account for some people. So, all that said, it's like people pay this every month, if you don't own. And so it's a really simple premise. And I like that. It's like, how can we just make paying rent more flexible? And it's been fun.
Very cool. Yeah. I mean, as someone who I lived in San Francisco for 9 years, I'm in San Diego now, and own my place, but renting in San Francisco was very challenging, and especially as a student. So I could see how that could be made so much more helpful for someone like me, especially back in those days. But I like that concept. Like I think we often in tech talk about like how can I describe what exactly it is that I do to my parents? And my dad actually happens to also be a designer and works in tech too, but my mom isn't. So I definitely resonate with that and the sort of simplicity aspect of it. It's very cool. I guess.
Yeah, I also find, if you don't mind me jumping in there too, like if you're working on something that's really simple that anyone can understand, you can learn about your product almost anywhere. I remember there was this one moment where I was at a bar in Boston years ago. This was like 2016 and 2017 or something. And I looked over and there was a couple using Hopper. I was at Hopper at the time on their phone. You could just see them using it in everyday life and listen to their conversation, which I did a little eavesdrop about. But you could do that. You could literally walk up to someone and say, "Hey, here's this thing. What do you think of it?" And you don't have to go through an extra layer in which a B2B company or something else might do. Both are insanely valuable and all of that, but it's just my preference. I love that ability to just be able to walk anywhere and maybe see someone using it, maybe learn from it.
Yeah, it's super rewarding. And I just love the idea, that you can kind of just go up to someone on the street or at a cafe or whatever, and, they could be someone who is using your product or could benefit from using it. And you could really just get to know that experience so viscerally. I've only really worked in enterprise software, and I've only worked at sort of like bigger tech companies, really. Well, when I was in college, I did work at some startups, but that was quite a while now. And so I don't share that same experience, but it makes me feel super energized. Like like being able to walk up to someone or like overhear them at a cafe talking about the thing you make, that there's nothing quite like that. And that's definitely, you get that with a startup. So I guess just to talk a little bit more about your background, just sort of preface all of the conversation we're going to have. What was your role at Turo? What was your role at Hopper? What was your role as far as product designer goes?
Yeah, I mean, it's varied quite a bit. And part of the reason for that is, you wear a lot of hats at startups. Like roles sometimes don't matter as much as they do on LinkedIn, when you're actually on the ground. And so I've seen quite a bit of range, so if I look back, even before Hopper, there was one of the early, and the first consumer tech company I worked for was funded by Grubhub. They were in Chicago. And, they were a consumer product that was aimed at, helping you book services. They failed ultimately, and we closed our doors. But in that scenario, I was the first designer early around launch, doing all the work myself. I kind of carried that over to Hopper. So when I went to Hopper, it was, they had been around for a while trying to find product market fit, but they were struggling to do that and finally seemed to hit on something that might be big. And so before they were launching that, I ended up joining as the first designer on that. And that meant I was doing the work. I was with the founders. I was with, the eventual head of product, and I just hacking out what the first version is going to look like and getting it to launch. And then, for multiple years after that, driving that. And, at some point you start to grow if you're in that early stage scenario. Fast was a version of this too, joined with two designer pre-launch. And then if you're lucky to make it work and you start to grow, and then it starts to shift a little bit. You make your first hire. You need to start maybe establishing your first processes or systems that can scale beyond you just doing all of the thing. Maybe you hired new PMs and you need to work with multiple teams or whatever. And so, by the time I left Hopper, I had several reports, and I had a design there at Fast. Near the end, I think I had roughly 15 or 16 designers and researchers. So I had managers who I was managing, and they were managing our larger team. But that, like I said, came from pre-launch, and I had two designers to scaling that. So quite an arc in lots of different, stages in there. And then, to Turo, I joined as a senior director. So that was one of the exceptions where I started pretty late stage. They were Series E or Series D in their funding life cycle, relatively big. And, I joined and inherited the consumer design team, what we call the guest design team. And so It's a little different in the sense I came in a manager role, but at the same time, I inherited like 2 designers, so scale, and then eventually hired more and grew that team. You're in the early stage is not looking that different than when you're coming in early stage and not formally in that role. So yeah, lots of scales.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up too. Something that's coming up a lot in this first season of the podcast is just how titles can be kind of confusing. I think maybe it's a tech thing. It definitely is a thing in the design community. But in startups especially, because that's an important thing to think about, I think, especially for people who are searching for a job and looking at those job recs right now and trying to figure out also like if they want to join a startup versus maybe trying to go for a more like mid to large size company. What are your interests? What are your goals? I was going to switch gears now to start talking about ramping up on a new job. Are you familiar with the 30, 60, 90 day framework?
Yeah.
Yes.
Loosely, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll explain. Yeah, I'll explain. So for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's essentially a framework that allows you to think about breaking up your first 3 months at a company into 30-day chunks. So 30 days your first month, 60 days your second, 90 is your third. And so sometimes at a company, your hiring manager may offer you this sort of framework to think about like some goals, some tasks, some things to do as you ramp up over those first 3 months. By the end, you can look back and say, hey, like I've done all these great things. I'm well on my way to like, the next sort of phase of starting your role there. So anyway, that'll just say, I wanted to sort of hear what your thoughts were about how someone might want to think about their first 3 months joining a startup. And a lot of new designers consider working at startups like as their first full-time job in product design. So what would you recommend to them? Maybe they're not given one of these documents, but like how should they think about those first 3 months of ramping up?
I'm smiling because most startups, having seen multiple scales, true startups, never had that for me. And so it's a great question because you have to kind of build that yourself. When I've been at bigger companies, there's often a lot of structure to onboarding. There might even be company level onboarding that you do that is completely independent of your manager or whatever. And that might even, at some big companies, take a week or something, and you're not even touching work. Every startup I've been at is the exact opposite of that. You're just in it. And so
not surprised.
Yeah. And so it's kind of up to you to build that roadmap. And honestly, the first thing on my mind when thinking about that is it probably seems really simple, but I think is more powerful than that simplicity suggests. And it's ask your manager or boss what their expectations are. Just ask them,
Easy.
literally,
simple
what
question.
are your expectations in my first 30, 60, 90 days? And I say this because I didn't do it up front. And you could build your own 30, 60, 90. But what you're doing is you're missing the chance to just get into their head because they're probably busy too. Startups are really naturally chaotic in some ways. And so they're probably having a lot on their plate. Hiring takes a lot of time. So if they don't have that for you, and maybe they're not even a designer, maybe they're for another department, their product, or, at times in early startups, I've reported directly to the CEO, who absolutely is not going to build you a 30, 60, 90 just with their schedule. Ultimately it doesn't hurt to just be like, what are your expectations? And if they don't have anything, that's okay. You know where they stand. And now it's your job to kind of fill that gap with your thoughts. If they do, it makes your job a lot easier. You now have an outline that you can fill in. I would also argue, it's worth not just only thinking about that though. If you get a list for them, if you only do that, you might be missing some really important opportunities to do what you feel like you need to do to learn and do the job well. But it's a great place to start.
Yeah, I guess especially if they're not a designer themselves either. They might not have the words or understanding around like what needs to be done in order to like get you ramped up. I guess like just like kind of reflecting back on, I don't know if how long this was, quite a while back, right? Like, but just like your time at Hopper, where you joined as more of an IC. What just as an example, like what was the first 3 months of ramping up there in more of a individual, that's what IC stands for, individual contributor route versus joining in as a VP? Yeah,
I guess like, because in addition to just saying, hey, you should ask someone what they think. I do find some trends in this that are kind of remarkably similar, at least in early startups, and especially when I'm an IC. And it's an oversimplification, but I'll explain it. But like, first, just do work. Like, just get in, pick off something. Ideally, something that's not really big, because if you're going to spend 3 months on it, it's going to hard to feel like you're getting momentum and some trust early on. But find something you can do in a week. A small thing.
Yeah.
Is it, update a field because that's been overdue that people care about, or like jumping on a project and shadow someone and help support that, or whatever it might be. But it's going to be really nice for you to feel like you're doing something tangible. And at the end of the day, the company, especially a startup versus a big company, they're already behind in their minds often on their roadmaps and the things they want to contribute. And so you'll build a ton of trust just by jumping in and showing that you can, give them value right away. I wouldn't, though, lose the fact that you're also onboarding, right? So don't only do work and then forget what is often really important, I think, in the first 30 days, which is just like absorbing how people are thinking about the problem space, attending key meetings, just seeing how the culture is working and what are the conversations that are happening, meeting key people. I often put like a meeting a day at a minimum when I'm at a new company with folks who I'll be partnering with outside of other departments, my team, et cetera, and just make sure that you're getting the time to hear their interests, and, also just allow you to dig into the data. Like, you have an idea from the outside, maybe you interviewed and said, hey, what is this product? Is it working? But when you're actually inside, you can see how it's working. And that's really valuable to understand it, people using it, adopting it, churning, that's all learning stuff that you should do in those first days. But unlike a bigger company, I wouldn't stall just getting into the work for that either. And so you kind of have to, in my mind, do both.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I really like that. There's some tangible things there. Setting up those meetings, probably with potentially everyone at the company, depending on how big the company is, and creating something in that first week. Do you think there's any differences then stepping in as a VP of product design? Are there any similarities or differences?
Honestly, I think there's both. Yeah, I think it's not that different in broad strokes. So if I abstract what I said a second ago, goodwill and trust, jump in, understand people's problems, and try and show some immediate impact is also, a pretty common theme. That first 30-day in particular, understanding, you don't always have the opportunity later to be, the least knowledgeable person in the room. And so you have a chance to ask some really fundamental, seemingly silly questions with no repercussions, and do that. It's my advice, ask questions about everything, because people give you a lot of slack and you learn a lot of things that maybe later on, especially at the executive level, people don't always want to say, everyone at that level has, I would guess, a little bit of an imposter syndrome at times, and a need to, to also show with some certainty what's happening. And so, if you're not careful, you kind of lose some of those insights. And so early on, just jumping in and doing that kind of absorption, what's happening, attending meetings, meeting people, that's all really the same. I think that where it really kind of differs is your first project will look a little different. The first thing you're going to do to have impact isn't probably going to be, a week-long, UI project. It's probably going to be, hey, what's our hiring funnel bottleneck and why is it a bottleneck and how do I untangle that? Or, hey, maybe we had some churn on the team before you joined. Why is that? Dig in and understand the team culture and so you can support them. Or, hey, maybe there's a critical, question about our data or issue in our data that could be design related. Help us understand how design can impact that. So, the problem space ends up being very different, but it's kind of the same at the end of the day. You don't want to push that stuff off for weeks. You just want to dive in.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's a really good segue, actually, to a new resource you created not too long ago called the Product Design Department Playbook. Did I get the name right?
Yeah. Names are silly, but yes.
Okay. Yes. I love it. I think it's great. No, it's great. It's very straightforward, PK. Well, I wanted to talk more about that because I've read through it a couple times now, and I think it's just got so much good stuff in there. So I was just wondering if you could start by sharing a bit about what it is and why you created it.
Yeah, I'll appreciate that for starters. And Honestly, it really ties into this theme of, startups just kind of having you dive in and build the plane while flying it. Because, really it stemmed from, doing this at several companies and my own experience doing that and feeling like there wasn't a clear roadmap from being an IC to saying, okay, now we're wanting to make our first hires. Hey, now we want to grow 10x, 5x, 2x, whatever it is in the X amount of time. How do I go from maybe a great job building the work to actually trying to make this a department or an org? And it's also tricky because, again, you're doing all that other work. You can't just turn it off and stop being an IC and now focus on growing. It's like you have to keep being the IC until you grow, your way out of it. So it started from that, and I just struggled to find good resources on it. There's a few, like Org Design for Design Orgs by Peter Marhols, you've probably seen. Yeah. That was a nice one. That was the first time I think I ever saw like some depth around just the boring but really impactful tactical parts of building a design team. So it was like really helpful in that sense, but there's still just something about my own experience that I think I was looking and seeing patterns but not able to articulate. And so some of it was just saying, hey, how do I build a mental model around what I've seen so that when I do this again, because I've now done it multiple times, like I don't have to start from scratch every time. Like what's the playbook I can roll out whenever I grow and support and build a design team.
Yeah, I think my mind is working that way a lot these days as well. It's like, okay, if I'm repeating myself this many times, like, can I just make this into a resource and share it with more people so that not only for myself, I can use it next time, but then I can, other people could benefit as well. Yeah. Well, just can you talk a little bit more about like, what is the framework? What is that mental model? I know there's some different pillars that you've developed people can think about, but then there's also kind of maybe it's values like structure, vision, storytelling. I don't know. How would you like break this down for people to help them better understand how to use it?
Yeah. Great question. So a few things. I mean, one, it starts from the premise that, a design department really has kind of two goals. And, for the sake of it too, let me clarify that design department in my mind, especially when we're talking about startups, could be the 16-person team or maybe bigger that I had when I was at Fast. It could also be 2 people. Yeah, this is still relevant in my mind. But it really has 2 goals. I think one is just ensure we build a great product that performs in market, and that touches on both the consumer side, but also, hey, it has to perform in market, so the business side. But the second piece being, in order to do that, you have to nurture and grow the team and culture that makes that happen. And when you're one person, some of that's you. It's how you self-manage to make sure that you can build a great product and do those things. But as soon as you add that second person, that third person, you suddenly have to ask new questions, and it stems from there. No longer to get the best product in market can you just do the work. You now have to say, how do I nurture this other person, these other people when you get to that point, to make it happen. So, it really starts around that. And that premise leads to really the framework that has worked for me. And it's that, ultimately then it focuses on clarifying what is expected of designers so that they can help build those great products. There's several things I think about. I can go through some of them, but like, are they high impact for the business? Do they understand the business metric? Are they customer oriented in their approach? Do they focus on pushing for a high quality bar in the output and the execution? Are they collaborative? These types of things. Efficiency, where you might imagine design systems rolling up. So, it focuses on what do we expect of each other, and do I expect of myself as a designer, new designers? And then ultimately, okay, what are the department levers to help nurture those designers to do that? And why I call it a playbook is because ultimately those levers really are kind of unique to your culture. On one hand, what you choose to employ, what's most relevant, what's most timely. It also is relevant to where the designers are and how they are across those things. But that at the same time, they're remarkably similar. And so if you give them a name, you can ultimately understand when you're in the weeds, what do I need to focus on? And so that's where the pillars come in. It's like you have these things you expect of designers. there's really four pillars I think that you have as levers to then support them. One's having a clear purpose. So if a designer, for example, is struggling to have impact for the business, why is that? Well, maybe there's a chance they don't actually have access to the business metrics and understand them, or maybe they don't know where the business is going in the next, year, or maybe we don't have a design vision and they don't understand where the consumer experience is going, and they're building things that aren't relevant. So purpose being one, having an efficient and effective procedure. So how do I work with a new designer? How do I manage new projects? How do I triage? All of that fits into this procedure bucket. The third one is just empowerment and support. So business is hard. Scrappy startup environments are hard. How do we make sure we have a voice in the conversations and some agency in it? And am I or the other folks supported in that? And then the fourth one is just resources, because if you don't have resources, you don't have Figma, or you don't have, additional headcount or whatever. And so those pillars are the places you can start to look for what place do you need to run to support your team. Well, again, like if we're struggling on execution quality, maybe it's a procedure thing. Maybe we don't have a design system and we're repeating a lot of problems, or maybe we just don't have the right designer with the UI skills we need for a UI heavy initiative. That's a resource issue. And so you can start to identify plays and other things you can run to support them.
Yeah, great. So just to reiterate, the pillars are purpose, procedure, support, and resources. Do you think that there's, or did you design this framework, like, do you need purpose in order to get resources? Or have you found like sometimes you might need, like maybe it's a resource and the purpose comes with that? Like, is there an order to these, or do you really do need to focus on all of them equally?
Really good question. What I've tried to do, because this is also, I think, has been true from my experience, is not to overly prescribe. But what I do think is all four of them have a place in building a team. Like you can't, from my experience, last very long successfully without purpose, procedure, support, and resourcing. And you might not have to do anything. Maybe those naturally already are solved for you out of the gate. Maybe you have such a great culture, you don't have to really worry about the empowerment support. But as you scale, even if all the other boxes are checked, maybe you start suddenly needing to pay attention to the procedure part because you haven't figured out how to scale, your roadmap and what you're working on and divvy up work and stuff like that. And so I like to think of it that way, to just say, hey, they're guides, they're things you should keep an eye on. And, when you actually look at the performance of your team, because they don't really matter in and of themselves, they're means to an end, they're the things you can look at to say, how do I support them? So, an example being, I like to think of like 4 steps to use the framework. Like one is identifying what problems or growth areas does your team have. So if you have 3 designers and maybe, you're seeing that we're consistently struggling with output and quality. Maybe the speed is not at where it needs to be for the needs, and maybe, we're not seeing the quality we want. Well, why is that? So identify first, like what are those things that from the designer standpoint we're not meeting and we feel like we want to. And then from there, actually, hypothesizing what are the plays you can run by looking at those 4 pillars. And so again, that's where I was like, hey, maybe it's a purpose issue. Like that's going to be unique to your company. But if it's a purpose issue, maybe they're just scrambling, doing things that aren't really impactful. And so now you can layer in those pieces. And then it's actually saying, okay, now I can give it a name. Let's run that play and see if we can ultimately improve that main thing we started with, if that's quality and execution. And so, okay, let's do that. You give it a time frame. I like to think about it, often quarterly, that, I'll set some goals, maybe run them for the quarter, and then reassess and say, okay, we improved in those areas, and then, cycle through that. And so that's where I say it's like, you probably have to think about all of them at some point, but what you'll do is kind of dependent on just the problems of the day for your team and where they're at.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It kind of, the identifying phase, it's like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Just like we would do with any of our design projects. Like we got to start by making sure we understand the issue, identifying it, and going from there. I guess just like thinking about, maybe I'm someone who's trying to get my first product design job, and I'm interested in working at a startup. And also there's just a lot of great opportunities, I think, at startups to join as a designer early on. would you say there's any of these three or any of these four pillars that would be the most challenging for that person to set up? Maybe I'm putting my bias into this. The purpose one is a really important one because a lot of the times, and maybe this is not as relevant to today, but over my career, there's been this sort of challenge of like, what is design's value? What's the business value of design? Like, how could someone, like, what has your experience been, I guess, like, especially for someone who might be joining in with not a lot of experience and, going into a new environment where there hasn't been a lot of design leadership, basically. Like, what do you think? What should they do?
Yeah. Let me start by saying that really resonates. I think if I was to choose like the most difficult pillars typically to support, it's probably purpose and resourcing. And they're really related more than my framework probably acknowledges. Like they're separate things, but like you need some clarity of purpose, goals, maybe in procedure to talk about your resourcing, and vice versa. When you're struggling with resourcing, it becomes really tricky maybe to carve out the time to say, hey, do I have a clear purpose? What I do like to think when I mention the flexibility of it, though, as a framework is a couple things. Like one, it can apply, like I was saying, if I'm a single designer. So I'm new at a startup, maybe I'm reporting to a product person or the CEO. The plays you can run under purpose, for example, can really vary. And that's where I like to say, like, do what's most effective for the problem at hand today. And so if you join and you're reporting to the CEO, how do you learn how your performance is going from the CEO? Well, maybe you ask them. Maybe you sit in one-on-ones, you say, hey, like, how am I doing? How is design doing in your mind? What are the biggest gaps? If you find that, I've heard this in different forms for different folks, is like, maybe they say, hey, like, I think you're doing some really cool work, but I don't really think you understand the business context. Then you can start to say, okay, well, why is that? Like, is it because of the metrics? Is it because I don't have a clear access to maybe key things there? Maybe it's even my own literacy. Like, I just don't understand business enough, and that's okay. But by identifying it, you can start to drive that. And why I mentioned the flexibility then is, in the grand scheme, like you could do things like vision work, or you could create UX health metrics and dashboards. And I think as scale and as you get in design leadership, like I have, you kind of have to think about driving those bigger, meatier issues. But even at that, individual level, or even when you're just building some early momentum, it doesn't have to be all of that. Do what works. And it may just be, hey, maybe I need to schedule a meeting weekly to go through the business metrics with my partner so I can understand them, knowing that in 3 months I'll now be literate, but today I'm not. Like that works, and that's tangible, and that's just scheduling a meeting and looking at a spreadsheet, once a week or whatever.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Just switching gears again, I know you've grown a lot of design teams, you've hired a lot of designers, right? So I guess I'm wondering, at a startup, are there specific early roles that you typically try to fill for your team to set the whole department up for success?
That's a good question. Yes and no at the same time. I'll describe what I mean by that.
Oh, yes, let's hear.
So, like, it kind of goes back to the many hats conversation earlier, that at an early stage company, I often focus on a couple things. Like, do you have the ability to wear many hats? Because we're going to need you to. Like it or not, like, especially in the earliest stages, you just can't really have a specialist. And even if they're super talented, like if you have someone who's really great at UI and they like just blow you away every time they build something, unless you have a product and a team that doesn't require any of the other facets of the design process, you're probably not going to be able to only rely on that designer. And it becomes a real trade-off. If you only have 2 designers, half of your team can really only do great UI. And so, this is a bit of an art, but I often like to personally myself keep a lot of early and quite senior generalists. I know that's not always great to hear for folks who want to break into it, but your ability to like carry weight when you're so small is really important. And so can you do a lot of things, and are you self-sufficient ends up being pretty important in that. And so, one, I would say that I think I often also look for folks who are comfortable with chaos, because those first few years are chaos. And as I've gotten more seasoned in my career, I try to buffer that, even in early stage startups, but you can't get away from, reorgs and changes in directions and, the highs and lows.
Especially at a startup.
Yeah.
I think that's really important that you shared that, though, about like, especially at a startup, look, like you're probably we already talked about this. You're going to be wearing many hats, especially if it's a small company. Yeah. You need to be good at sort of the whole spectrum of product design, from that early iteration, sort of research, identifying the problem stage, prototyping, and designing out the final deliverables, like what the product should actually, how it should actually look, how it should function. And so I think that's important for people to hear, like, especially when they're starting their career. It just means that you have to practice those skills and, put yourself into educational opportunities that can help you refine the whole spectrum, right? I mean, that's just that's kind of the reality of it.
Yeah. And another way to maybe add on to that, hearing you say that, is wearing a lot of hats is also recognizing a few other things that I find are pretty true at early stage. One is, as much as I would like to hire a researcher as one of my first employees, typically you have very, very limited early budget. And if I am the only designer and I had to choose between a researcher and a second designer, when your product team is going to hire another product manager, for example, it's a really hard trade-off. And so a lot of companies, myself included, is actually want that, don't end up hiring a researcher right away. I'd like to bring them in early, but it's usually not my first hire. And so thinking about those first few folks who join a startup too, is being comfortable in navigating the need to probably play that role a little bit. It doesn't mean you have to be a full-time researcher, but just navigating, even doing, unmoderated user testing or something like that you can run on your own. Like, that's a good skill to have. And that also kind of dovetails in the second point, which is ultimately most of your peers will not be designers at that stage. And so being able to understand the things they care about, the folks in product, the folks in eng, the business people on the sales team, depending on how big your company is, will make you a better partner to them. And, that is going to help build trust in your success at that org. So, the good news too is, like, startups are a great way to learn those things, even if you don't have them out of the gate. So, like, I've learned that from just spending a lot of time with non-designers in those early stages. But, there's also a lot of stuff you can do outside of that, even before your first job, to learn that, like read articles on product and product roadmap processes and thinking and metrics. And that stuff really helps when that's your biggest set of partners and collaborators.
Yeah, that's a good point, PK. I really appreciate you sharing that perspective as well. The more research you can do and the more clarity you can get on what sort of role you are looking for, like if you want to go all in on startups and you really can refine your portfolio, your work, the way you talk about what your goals and your interests are, the more that's going to show when you're in that interview process, and that you can really step up to the plate and offer those sort of perspectives like, hey, I know this is, maybe these are some skills I know I'm really working on, but I have these other skills, whatever it might be for you, that I know are going to be really important for, the stage of company that we're like, that so-and-so company is at, so that I can offer that. So I think it's a lot of it just kind of comes back to like how clear can you get around what you want and really go after those companies. That's going to help you stand out.
100%.
But I guess,
well said.
Yeah. So I guess kind of on that note too, though, design portfolios. It's a very important. Design portfolio is a very important artifact, I guess, to have going into interviews, because I think they're really great. It's one of the most objective ways I think we can evaluate candidates for roles. Not all industries really have something like this. So what does a standout candidate do to catch your attention in the portfolio review phase?
That is such a good question. Can I start by expressing, I think, the reality of being in that phase on the other side?
Yes, actually, I think that's really important for people to hear, because it's, it kind of goes both ways, I think. So I'd love for you to start that.
So why this is important to me is because there was a point post-college where I was trying to get my first design job. And I studied design when the first iPhone came out. So I was learning mostly like graphic and marketing design, and then apps took over. And I was trying to break into that. I didn't really have that portfolio and that experience yet. And so I was working at coffee shops and at bakeries in the Midwest and in Boston for a bit. And I was struggling to get my first job. So I'm working at these bakeries, taking some odd, like freelance gigs. And I'm trying to answer this question myself. And I got rejected so many times. There's a point before I got my first full-time job where I think I had like 300 applications out there and I didn't get it.
Yeah.
And I was frustrated. There's a point where I was frustrated and I was like, come on, like I know I could do this. Why am I not getting these gigs? And, it was years later, and I'm now making my first hires at startups, that I realized how fuzzy the process ends up being on both sides. And it's no knock on either side, but just understanding the limitations of the process can help you set yourself up for success for it. And the main one in my mind is there were moments at the craziest times in my career where we're scaling really fast. Other teams are scaling. We don't even have a presence because we're a startup in this design space or the market. So, you also don't just have magically inbound coming in. You have to generate it. You have to create interest to find your first few folks. And that's either your network or whatever it might be. And you're also doing the work. And so you already had a full-time job. You're running out of time to do all the things you had to do because you were growing. And now you have to add what is another full-time job on top of it, which is write the first job description, get the tools set up, because often HR isn't fully developed yet at those stages. And so it meant that I literally had to map this out once that with the inbound we were getting and things like this, like I had to do my first pass at portfolios in less than 30 seconds, or I wouldn't be able to get through the inbound. And so this screening process of how do you just like, when you start to get some inbound, you're also doing these other things. How do you get through it? Well, you're not spending much time. It's not like we sit and, often, and maybe it depends on team and scale, but like, it's not like hiring managers really have the time to sit for, several minutes through your portfolio and really admire it. Now, sometimes I would do that once that 30-second piece flagged that there's something interesting there. Then I would double click and go a little deeper. And so, I would think about just like that.
You think about just like the math, like if I spent 10 minutes and I'm reviewing 50 portfolios, like that's a lot of time. Like that doesn't scale very well, especially if you're one person. So that perspective, like you said, I think is really important for people to hear and understand.
Yeah. And the other piece is, so the math to your point works out is that you might spend 10, 20 minutes. And if you're doing a minute per each, that's only 20 portfolios to get through in 20 minutes. Well, if you have hundreds coming in, you also want to make sure that you get through them, because maybe your best designer, perfect match is later in that funnel. You just don't want to skim off the top and then call it a day. And so how do you get both breadth and also find the right person? That's the challenge in a short amount of time.
That is the challenge. So then so someone understands this now. That's how the math works out. That's the timing of it. What should they do, or what could they do to stand out in that phase? Do you have any examples too of ones that are really memorable for you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a couple things, which this may be my bias, because the other point to note is every hiring manager is a little different. And when you look at the process and how it has its own flaws embedded in it, that we have to bring our own flavors to what we look for. And that's also unique to the company. What are you hiring for? What kind of product are you? But if I was to oversimplify and say the things that seem pretty consistent, at least from all the times I've done it, it's a few things. One, like I don't have time, like I said, to really read through a big case study. So if you give me a wall of text, there's a really good chance I won't read it. And that's just the reality of it. And so when I've seen sometimes portfolios that do, on one hand, a great job of saying, look at this whole case study. It's a whole process I went through. I did research. You hit all the right things, but you told me everything. That almost hurts your case when it seems like it shouldn't. And so I like to think, as silly as it sounds, like crisp storytelling is important. Like cut to the chase. And what is a chase? Well, if you're applying for a product design job, it's not just look at all the technical things I can do. It's, did I solve a problem? Right? Was it I improved conversion? Maybe I helped retention. Maybe I solved a major, CS, contact problem. We were getting all these issues in CS and I helped resolve it, and that was good for the business. But leading in with that, like, hey, I did this thing. Here's an example of it, a beautiful picture of it, or, an example in a mock-up or a prototype. And now let me break down some of the key points that were important to that success. And, do it. Look at Apple's website when they pitch a new product, or they have new version of their iOS app.
Yeah.
It's chunked. There's a big title. There's maybe a paragraph, and move on to the next thing. Don't go much deeper unless we ask for it.
Yeah. I like to say when I'm talking about this topic with people who are trying to break into design too, I like to say, think about the very top section of your portfolio like a movie trailer. It's like you want to get someone excited and interested in the work. Yeah. And then once you've captured their attention, then that's where all of the bulk of the content can go. And to your point, like if you do find a standout candidate through that process, maybe you will spend another minute, 5 minutes, whatever it is, reviewing their work to really, because you're excited about them now. But until you've captured their intention in that way, it's going to be hard for them to get to that point, because again, there's so many candidates for you to review.
I love that. Have you ever heard of the Minto pyramid?
No, tell me, what is that?
So it's basically, there's a few different flavors of this, but I first learned of it as the Minto pyramid. But it's a way to think about writing and business communication. And without over drawing it out, I'd say really just how can you be more effective and crisp with your content? And the simple thing that I was doing wrong very early in my career that I think applies to what you just said is it says basically state your conclusion at the top of the pyramid and then expand out. And I was often doing it the other way. Like, here's my whole story, and then look at my really punchy, beautiful conclusion. And basically what you're saying is like, flip it. Like, put the conclusion at the top, make it punchy. That's your hook. If I only read that, but I'm like, oh, wow, they understand the business problem and did it. That's cool. Maybe I can now choose to dig deeper. Maybe I don't even need to. Maybe I see it as crisp. I see a really beautiful UI. I see that. I put it in my back pocket, knowing I'll come back to that portfolio later to dig in. And so it's not that different than progressive disclosure, a very common design pattern, right? Where you say, hey, let me just give you something. And assuming that works and that fits your needs, you can expand and dig deeper into it.
Excellent. I get a lot of questions in the community about student work, personal projects. Hey, I'd love to include some data or some key metrics that would go along with this project, but it's not real. How do I do that? What is your perspective on student work or personal projects as it relates to telling that concise, catchy story, movie trailer thing at the top?
Yeah. Yeah. I would also guess there's slightly different takes on this. Mine is, I have a few things that come to mind. One is, and this applies even to actual product work, is don't be too salesy or too cookie cutter with it. And so if it's personal work and you haven't done it, you don't want to oversell that and pretend like it's real when it's not, because that always frustrates me as a hiring manager when you're like, wait, you talked about this the whole time like it was a real thing, and now that I dug into your work history, it doesn't seem to be. And so you want to be honest, and I think authentic about that. And so the first thing I would say is, hey, if not, maybe talk about how you would think about it, right? What hypothesis you're driving on, how you might validate that, right? What things you would look for or are looking for, so that if it was a real project, we have a sense of how you think about it. But the more dramatic way to answer that is well, can you put something out there? Are there ways to make more tangible that problem? Is it get a prototype in front of some people and get some feedback? It's going to be imperfect, but even acknowledging that, well, this is flawed, but here's what I found out in this type of, guerrilla test or whatever, can be meaningful. If you have chances to also, do sometimes volunteer work for folks just to get it. If you're going to sit at home and do something that is just a personal project, but not put it out in the world, you could ask people to do work for them. You want to be careful about, just doing free work for folks, but it's not really that, the different at the end of the day. And now you actually might have some data points. So there are opportunities. I think it's worth thinking about that as well.
Yeah, it all just comes down to how can you demonstrate that you have the skills that we're looking for as it relates to the job that you're hiring for. And so it can be scrappy in its own way if it's a personal project. But yeah, I think to your point too, as someone who's reviewed a lot of portfolios as well, making sure that it's clear what type of project it is just helps me as the reviewer ask better questions basically in that next stage.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
Going back to the PDD framework too, it's like, what do I look for when I'm skimming those things? Like we mentioned it, it's like, do I understand the business? It's not just cool that I built something beautiful. Do I understand the business potential behind it? Even if it's not a real project, a case study, do I understand that context? And then yes, do I understand the customer? So I would think about those pieces as well, right? How do I work with people? Does it take care of both the business and the customer? Is it high quality? How did I think about the system behind it? Like all those things are good to tease out.
Yeah. How about while interviewing? So someone's made it past that portfolio review state. How do they stand out as a candidate that is now in the interview phase?
Yeah, I mean, as silly as it sounds, I don't personally find it to be that different. It's almost more like validating what I see in the portfolio. If they do that first part well, which is, hey, I told a really crisp story that shows a balance of the business, customer, context, those types of things. One, I want to see that, like that is true, right? That's just not a veneer on it. And so just digging in and being able to see how they tell that story. Are they crisp as in, verbalizing it as their portfolio is? That stuff's really helpful. Do they understand the problem deeply? Like if I kick at it, do they understand it deeply? And hey, even if not, are they able to acknowledge, or at least like play the mental exercise of, well, no, I haven't thought about this, but it may be interesting for these reasons. I want to see that there's some depth to that, critical thinking around the problem space. I'd also say it's probably silly, but it almost is independent of that is, do they care about your company? Like it's cool if I could go through their portfolio. Well, almost one of the first things I want to know when I talk, in addition to that, after seeing it, is like, are we interesting to you? Are you interested just because we are one tech job and you're looking for a job and you've applied to 300, like maybe I did in the past? Or are you actually interested in, now I'm at Flex in our problem space and why, and being able to make a bridge between your work and that, or at least, show the interest in an authentic way is something I always want to know. And that comes through both how you answer a question like that, like why are you interested in our company? But also when we give you the opportunity to ask questions, I'm curious how you dig in and, try and talk to me. So that combination of like, do the things I saw the portfolio hold up? And is there a real interest in the problem we're solving? Because startups are hard. And, if you're just here for the tech job, you're going to get pretty tired after a short bit of time. Yeah. One like pro tip, if you will, in my mind, and I've applied it both when I've been in IC, but when I've applied for, VP or head of design roles, is going back to the premise that most startups are under-resourced, they're busy, they're trying to build the plane while flying it. Showing empathy to that in the process is also a bit of what we're getting at here. And it's, hey, the person's probably really busy. They're probably looking at a lot of candidates. They're just trying to make the best decision they can with limited resources on, are you a good fit? And so if that's the case, even just getting past the really formal side of like, here's my portfolio, what questions do you have? And really saying like, hey, what are your problems? What are you grappling with? And being able to then speak to your portfolio or speak to your skill sets in that vein. It's kind of like workshopping rather than interviewing. And I always find those are the most interesting ones where you're actually now sitting in the room and you go from, meet and greet to suddenly you talking about an active problem that they care about. If you can speak to that, do it, because the person on the other side is like, oh, this person's not interested in my problem space in practice, right? Instead of asking about why they're interested in Flex, right? He's just talking about a problem and they're showing their interest, through that willingness to just kind of talk through the things that are on our mind. And that really builds some trust a lot of the time.
Yeah. And would you say that it's pretty common then for someone who's interviewing, for a designer that's interviewing at a startup, to meet with the CEO as a part of the interview process?
That's a great question. I don't think it's uncommon. So why I say it that way is like, as a first designer, which I've been at times, absolutely, like that is almost one of the first calls you have. And multiple times I've had them or sat down for coffee in person before moving forward with the founders or CEO. If you're the second hire, it often ends up being a question on, is it useful? In other words, like, hey, if you have a good relationship with the CEO or the founders or whoever it might be, they often have put it on me, like, hey, is it helpful if I talk to them? And what that means is I think a lot of times, yeah, like you both from a sales angle, like I want them to, get excited, and the CEO is a great person to maybe do that when you're still trying to build your brand as a company. But the second piece is they're often a really good gauge of maybe what might be good for the company, and you'll get buy-in from the CEO with that hire. So on the hire manager side, you have to be careful too that you're also not over-indexing on that. But all that to say, I think for the person, it means you have to plan for it being a real possibility if you're one of the first handful of hires. I think as it gets deeper than that, maybe not, but I've always had those conversations in the first 5 roles at the companies I've been at.
Do you have any insights or advice for someone who might, find themselves in that situation talking to a CEO? How could they best prepare themselves for that interview?
That is such a good question. That's probably the most daunting call, I would guess, if you're on the phone.
I would be nervous for sure.
I'll start by saying CEOs are remarkably different and remarkably the same in some ways. So you have to prepare for a little bit of surprise. But at the same time, the predictability side is their job, among others, is to make this thing succeed. And they probably have a ton of pressures to do that. And when it comes to design, they're probably looking at it saying, hey, I don't have maybe even much expertise in this for a lot of folks, but I kind of feel like I see good design sometimes. So I feel like I could point to something that I like. And so really I want to vet that this person's a critical thinker, that they have a strong sense of the business, and they're not going to hurt the business by being a designer here. And hey, that they have good design sensibilities, whatever that means in my limited way. And so, this almost goes back to that other piece of kind of workshopping together, is like show interest in the business, ask good questions about the business fundamentals. And there's so many articles and things online on just understanding the businesses. It's a e-commerce startup, like learn the basic kind of business metrics and things that are worth knowing from that business, and being prepared to ask those questions and talk about it could be valuable. You could be able to have that conversation now with them. Maybe have some things ready in case they show interest in wanting to see design work that you could pull up and show them, and make sure it's some high quality work and, put the best foot forward. And I think those things often are enough, because the calls really aren't very long with CEOs either. They're very busy. So they go pretty quick too.
So there have been so many layoffs in tech recently, and there also seems to be a lot of empathy, or there always seems to be a lot of empathy, rather, for those who are laid off, myself included. But I guess I'm wondering what your advice might be for someone who's trying to get their first product design job in this market.
Oh, it's a hard thing. Absolutely a lot of empathy, and when I started looking for jobs, it was near the end of the 2008 crisis and downturn. So that was around the time I would apply to the 300 jobs that I didn't get. And so if that, is any relevance to what that might be like, I think first it's worth acknowledging, like, it's probably not you. Like, first, just get your head in the right place, because it's hard. And, if you get rejected a lot, it can feel pretty bad. And I think that's the first thing. Like, don't let that get you. It's a numbers game, and there's a lot of people looking for jobs. And hey, if you're close to, product funnels, it's not that different than a conversion funnel, right? If there are less jobs, less people, I guess getting roles, and then on top of it, you have a lot of people looking, like, that means you're probably going to interview more in many cases. And so I think just recognize that, like, play the numbers game and don't think it's you. Don't let that get you down. The second thing I would say is, like, given that, like, it helps to just get closer to folks in the space. Like, referrals, I hate to say it, are so important. And really, even if you have a great portfolio, you could maybe still lose out to someone who has a really strong connection to the team and the folks who are already at a company. And so just acknowledging that reality can help set you up, right? If you're applying for jobs, are you writing, a resume and sending it and then not following up with anyone at that company? That's going to actually hurt your chances. So how can you get closer to those folks? It might be, sending out cold emails, reaching out on LinkedIn. It might be working through your network and seeing who knows other people and how can you get an intro. And honestly, getting the intro from someone and is trusted, who's an intermediary, can be really valuable. A friend who has worked there or knows that person, sending an email to them, showing your interest can be huge. And so, don't just, sit and send in for applications, but try and build relationships in this story.
Yeah, I usually like to say, I think success comes from a combination of hard work and getting lucky. So it's like the hard work is you gotta have the skills, the technical design skills to get the job. But then you also have to get lucky. You have to put yourself out there and create those serendipitous moments in your life that, you'll meet one person that could then introduce you to another that could then help introduce you to you're someone who can get you a job, or the role that you get. So it's putting yourself out there is a huge part of the equation. And for whatever reason, 100%. When you were saying that, I was thinking of my purchasing behavior. I really rely on reviews. And I'm doing a lot of online shopping these days. I don't know if it's just because it's 2023 now, or with COVID and the pandemic, it's a lot of us moved online. Obviously, with Fast, you're very familiar with people's buying behavior. But reviews go a long way. And so kind of similar to purchasing a product online, what is that sort of referral, or what can someone say or speak to you in your experience that could then kind of move you along into the interview funnel?
Yeah, I love that. And honestly, networking sometimes gets a bad rap because it feels kind of salesy and cold and motivated. But if you reframe it as, hey, you want to work in tech, there are people who hire other people in tech, CEOs, managers, heads of design, product people, and they're working on problem spaces you probably find interesting. Networking can just be about building relationships with those people. And it's hard because that's a long game in many ways, the deeper relationships, that's something you should be doing over probably years and nurturing those. But if you do, you will have, an insane advantage in your career, and it won't feel often like work. It's just, you've now made a lot of really cool friends in the space. And I've literally had moments where we're hiring someone and I can text a friend in my network and say, hey, I think you've worked with this person, any thoughts? And it might be that simple. You're not even that structured in your ask. It's just hey, any flags? And so building good relationships and maintaining that, even if you leave a company, et cetera, is so important. And so it doesn't mean you have to wait years to see the benefits of that, but treat it as a long game. And the short game might be, make that connection, make that cold email, whatever it might be.
Yes, I think that's a great note to end on. PK, I think everyone at this point is thinking, I want to join PK's team. I certainly am. I would love to join a team, or a startup rather, especially where there's this product design department playbook in place, and all these sort of mental models for how to really thoughtfully build up and grow a team. So thank you so much for sharing your story and spending time with me today, sharing all of your knowledge. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up? And, where can people find you online? Where can people find the product design department playbook?
Yeah. So, first, back at you. I enjoyed this. Thanks for listening, folks. And, I would say a couple things. One, design's hard. It's tricky. It's a journey. Treat it as one. All these things I'm sharing are not dogmatic either. It's you got to learn for yourself. I think that is an important part of design as a practice, and it applies here. And so hopefully it's helpful, but, take what you will and take what works. And so from there, I'd like to write about this stuff. I think about this stuff a lot. I have a Substack, pksays.substack.com. I'm also on Twitter, Puntalisek. So always happy to continue these conversations in the many places they appear online, and I will engage with anybody who's interested in having it. So tell Tell them to find me if they're interested.
Look at that. You've got a connection. If you're listening to this podcast, make sure to follow PK on Twitter. Check out his Substack. We'll make sure all of these links are in the show notes so you can go check them out. PK, thank you again. This is one of many, many conversations later on. I'm sure we will have. So thank you so much for spending the time again, and we'll talk soon.
Pleasure. Back at you.
PK just shared with us a lot of good reasons around why joining a startup could be a good path forward for a growing designer. If you're interested in taking that next big step with your career in UX design and maybe even join a startup but don't know where to start, then listen up. Springboard offers a 9-month UI UX design bootcamp with one-on-one mentorship, real-world design projects, and personalized career coaching. And it comes with a job guarantee. Use the code ADAPTIVEBYDESIGN to get $1,000 off enrollment for design bootcamps with Springboard. You can find more information in the description below. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date as new episodes drop. Again, my name is Alexa, and you've been listening to Adaptive by Design, Living the UX Life. I'll see you next time.